At 7:52 p.m. on a Wednesday evening, a trauma nurse named Linda walked out of St. Mary's Hospital in Phoenix after her 12-hour shift and broke down crying in the parking garage. Not the quiet kind of crying you do when you're tired. The kind that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere you've been holding it together for so long that when it finally cracks, it cracks completely. She sat on the concrete floor between two parked cars, back against a pillar, knees pulled to her chest, and let it out. Every bit of it. 18 years. 18 years of 12-hour shifts in the trauma unit. 18 years of holding strangers' hands while they died. 18 years of running codes, managing chaos, making split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or went home in a bag. She'd won 2 commendations from the hospital for her work during mass casualty events, one after a highway pileup that brought in 47 patients in a single night, another after an industrial fire that filled every trauma bay they had. She'd never called in sick, not once in 18 years. She'd shown up with a 102-degree fever. She'd worked the day after her father's funeral because the unit was short-staffed and she knew her patients needed her. She had given everything she had to that hospital. Everything. And they had taken her mother's cancer treatment away with a 2-paragraph email. If you've ever watched someone you love fight for their life while the system fights against them at the same time, hit that like button right now, because this story is for every single one of you. Linda's mother, Rose, was 67 years old. She'd been a schoolteacher in Tucson for 32 years before retiring. She was the kind of woman who remembered every student's birthday, who kept in touch with former students decades after they graduated, who still made homemade tamales every Christmas and distributed them to her neighbors. She was the kind of woman who made the world softer just by being in it. And 4 months ago, she'd been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. The diagnosis came out of nowhere. Rose had gone in for a routine checkup, nothing alarming, just annual blood work. 2 days later, her doctor called her back in. The tests showed abnormal cells. A biopsy confirmed it. Stage 2, the oncologist said. Aggressive but treatable. There was a specific chemotherapy protocol, chemo, a combination of drugs that had an 80% success rate for her type of lymphoma. The treatment was expensive, roughly $47,000 for the full course. But Linda was covered under St. Mary's Hospital insurance, and the policy included dependent coverage for parents. Rose would be covered. They started the paperwork immediately. Linda spent 3 weeks coordinating everything: doctor consultations, pre-treatment blood work, lab tests, insurance pre-authorizations. She navigated the paperwork with the same precision she brought to the trauma unit. She made lists. She followed up on every form. She documented every conversation. By the end of the 3rd week, everything was in place. Rose's first treatment was scheduled for the following Tuesday. The oncologist was optimistic. The treatment team was ready. Rose had started telling her neighbors she was going to beat this thing, that she'd be back to making tamales by Christmas. Then Linda got the email. It arrived on a Wednesday morning at 6:17 a.m., while Linda was 30 minutes into her shift. A mass communication from the hospital's Human Resources Department. Subject line: Important update regarding employee benefits. Linda didn't have time to read it during her shift. The trauma unit was busy, 2 critical patients, a code blue at noon. She didn't read it until her break at 4 p.m. She sat in the break room, coffee in hand, and opened the email. The hospital had switched insurance providers effective 30 days ago. The new provider, a company called Meridian Healthcare Solutions, offered lower premiums but a significantly reduced coverage network. Dozens of specialists were no longer covered. Several treatment protocols had been reclassified, and dependent coverage for parents over 65 had been restructured under a new cost-sharing model that required a minimum of 6 months of continuous enrollment before major procedures would be covered at the previous rate. Rose had only been enrolled for 4 months. She didn't meet the threshold. Under the new policy, her chemotherapy would be covered at 40%. Linda would owe 60% out of pocket. That was $28,200. Money Linda didn't have. She'd spent her savings on her father's medical bills 3 years ago. She had $4,100 in her checking account and $800 in savings. She read the email 4 times, certain she was misreading it. She wasn't. She called HR. The representative confirmed everything with the cheerful efficiency of someone reading from a script. Linda asked if there was an exemption process for active treatments. The representative said she'd have to submit a formal appeal. Processing time 6 to 8 weeks. Rosie's treatment was scheduled for next Tuesday. She didn't have 6 to 8 weeks. The treatment window mattered. Delay the first cycle and the cancer cells adapted. The oncologist had been clear about that. Timing was critical. Linda spent the next 2 hours making calls. She called the insurance company. She called the hospital's benefits coordinator. She called the hospital's patient advocate office and explained that she herself was a hospital employee and that the policy change was affecting her mother's active cancer treatment. Everyone was sympathetic. Everyone was sorry. Everyone said there was nothing they could do right now, and she should file the formal appeal. Linda filed the appeal online while standing at the nurse's station between patients. She submitted every document they asked for: diagnosis records, treatment plans, pre-authorization approvals from the old policy, letters from the oncologist explaining the time sensitivity. She sent it all in at 5:30 p.m. and then walked back to the trauma unit to finish her shift. By the time 7:52 p.m. arrived and her replacement came in, Linda had held herself together for 13 hours. She walked through the parking garage on autopilot. She didn't even realize she was crying until she was already on the floor. She didn't have the energy to stand back up, so she just sat there, in the oil-stained concrete dark between two cars, and let the wall come down. That's where Doc found her. His real name was Raymond Ortega. They called him Doc because he'd spent 11 years as a paramedic before a shoulder injury ended his career in the field. He was 44 years old, compact and solid, with calloused hands and the kind of eyes that assessed situations quickly, a habit from years of arriving at scenes where every second counted. He'd been riding with the Hells Angels for 7 years. He was at St. Mary's that evening visiting a fellow member who'd been admitted for knee surgery. He took the parking garage exit because it was faster than the main lobby. He heard her before he saw her. The sound of someone crying that hard, not crying for show, but crying from exhaustion and defeat, was something he recognized immediately. He'd heard it at accident scenes, at houses where he'd been called too late. He walked toward the sound and found Linda sitting on the floor, still in her scrubs, name badge clipped to her pocket, staring at nothing. He didn't walk past. Doc was not a man who walked past things that needed his attention. He crouched down a few feet away, close enough to be present, far enough not to crowd her. "Hey." His voice was quiet, matter of fact, not pitting alarm, just present. Linda looked up, a big man in a leather vest, death head patch on the chest. She probably should have been startled. She wasn't. She was too worn out for fear. "You okay?" She almost laughed at the question. "No," she said, "not even close." Doc nodded. "You want to talk about it, or you want me to leave you alone?" Linda thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. Then she told him everything. She told him about Rose, about the diagnosis and the treatment plan and the 3 weeks of paperwork. She told him about the email and the insurance switch and the coverage threshold she didn't meet. She told him about the 6 to 8 week appeal timeline and the oncologist's warning about treatment delays. She told him about the 28,200 she didn't have and the 4,100 in her checking account. She told him about 18 years of perfect attendance and 2 commendations and never once asking this hospital for anything. She talked for 12 minutes straight without stopping, words pouring out of her with the same urgency as everything she'd been holding in all day. Doc listened without interrupting. He sat cross-legged on the parking garage floor across from her, elbows on his knees, and just listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The hospital switched providers to save money. Your mother is 67 with active cancer and a treatment window, and their position is that she should wait 6 to 8 weeks for an appeal." Linda nodded. "That's exactly their position." Doc looked at her name badge. "How long have you been a nurse here?" 18 years. He nodded slowly. The kind of nod that means a decision has been made. "Give me your number. I'm going to make some calls." Now, if you're new to this channel, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because we tell stories exactly like this one every single week. Stories that remind you what it looks like when real people refuse to let injustice win. Doc called his club president from the parking garage before he even reached his bike. The president's name was Victor, but everyone called him Gage. Gage was 51 years old, a former army medic who'd served 2 tours in the Gulf War. He'd founded the Phoenix chapter of the Hells Angels 12 years ago with a specific philosophy: the club served the community, not as a PR move, not for optics, because it was the right thing to do. He'd built the chapter around veterans, first responders, and tradespeople, people who understood service and sacrifice. When Doc called him and explained Linda's situation, Gage asked 3 questions. How long has she worked there? 18 years. What's the hospital's reasoning? They switched insurance to save money. Coverage threshold wasn't met. How much time does her mother have before the treatment window closes? 10 days, maybe 12. Gage was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. I'll make some calls. Be at my place at 9 tomorrow morning. By 9 the next morning, 28 Hells Angels were gathered at Gage's house on the east side of Phoenix. They sat on motorcycles in the driveway, stood in the garage, leaned against trucks in the street. Mechanics, veterans. A retired police detective named Steele. A real estate attorney named Bolt, who was a full patch member and had been riding with the club for 9 years. A former hospital administrator named Cruz, who'd left the industry over ethical disagreements and now ran a small construction company. And Doc, who understood exactly how hospitals worked and exactly how they didn't. Gage stood in the center of the garage and laid it out clearly. A trauma nurse at St. Mary's, 18 years of perfect service. Mother with active lymphoma. Treatment scheduled. Insurance switched without adequate notice. Coverage threshold not met by 60 days. Appeal timeline 6 to 8 weeks. Treatment window 10 days. He paused. This is not a complicated situation. It's a hospital that made a financial decision that is actively harming its own employees and their families. We are going to walk in there and request a meeting with the decision makers. We will be respectful. We will be factual. And we will not leave until this is resolved. He looked around the garage. Any questions? There were none. They called St. Mary's at 9:47 a.m. and asked to speak with the hospital's chief operating officer. The receptionist, after a brief pause, connected them to an administrative assistant who said the CO was unavailable. Bolt, who had spent 9 years practicing law before joining the Hells Angels full-time, asked calmly what the CO's calendar looked like for the following morning. The assistant said she'd have to check. Bolt said that was fine and that he'd hold. He held for 6 minutes. Then the assistant came back and said the CO could make time at 9:30 a.m. the following day. Bolt confirmed the appointment, gave his name, and hung up. 28 Hells Angels arrived at St. Mary's the next morning at 10:15 a.m. They were not there to intimidate. They were there to advocate. They wore their cuts, leather vests bearing the death head patch, because those vests represented who they were, and they were not in the habit of hiding who they were. They parked their motorcycles in an orderly row in the visitor lot. They walked through the front entrance in a group and approached the reception desk. Doc asked for the CO's assistant by name. The lobby went quiet. Staff at the reception desk stared. A security guard moved toward them, but stopped when he realized they weren't causing any problem. They were just standing there, calm and organized, waiting. The assistant came down personally and escorted them to a conference room on the 4th floor. The COO, a man in his late 40s named Preston Walsh, arrived with 2 HR directors and the hospital's legal counsel. Walsh looked at 28 Hells Angels seated around a conference table and did his best to keep his expression professional. He introduced himself. Gage introduced the group simply. We're here on behalf of Linda Reyes, a trauma nurse who has worked in your hospital for 18 years. Walsh nodded carefully. I'm familiar with the situation. We understand there's a concern about the recent benefits transition. Gage said, it's not a concern. It's a crisis. A member of your staff has devoted 18 years to this institution. Her mother has active non-Hodgkin lymphoma with a critical treatment window. Your insurance transition eliminated her coverage because of a 60-day threshold she missed by 4 months. Your appeal process takes 6 to 8 weeks. Her treatment window is 10 days. These 2 timelines are incompatible. Walsh started to speak. Bolt held up one hand, a quiet, measured gesture. Let me finish, please. Walsh stopped. Bolt continued. We are not here to threaten anyone. We're here because we've looked at this situation carefully, and the facts are clear. Your hospital saved approximately $340,000 annually by switching insurance providers. The new policy has gaps that directly harm your long-term employees. We'd like you to explain how saving $340,000 justifies jeopardizing the cancer treatment of a nurse who has never missed a single shift in 18 years. Walsh looked at his legal counsel. His counsel gave a barely perceptible shrug that meant they've done their homework. Cruz, the former hospital administrator, spoke next. He laid out the specific provisions of the Affordable Care Act that govern mid-treatment coverage transitions. He cited 3 federal rulings that established precedent for continuity of care. He explained that the appeal Linda had filed triggered a specific regulatory review process that, if mishandled, could expose the hospital to significant liability. He spoke for 9 minutes without notes. When he finished, the room was very quiet. Walsh asked for 15 minutes to confer privately with his team. Gage said, "Of course, we'll wait." The hospital team left the room. The Hells Angels sat in silence. Some checked their phones. Doc stared at the ceiling. Bolt reviewed notes on a legal pad. Gage sat with his hands folded on the table, completely still. Comment below right now and tell us, have you ever faced a situation where the system failed you or someone you love? Because what happened in the next 15 minutes proves that sometimes the people who actually fight for you are the ones you'd least expect. When Walsh returned, his demeanor had changed. The careful, managed professionalism was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. He sat down and looked at Gage. "We've reviewed the situation internally. Given the extenuating circumstances, the length of Ms. Reyes's service, the active nature of her mother's treatment, and the timeline involved, we're prepared to grant an immediate exemption. Mrs. Rose Reyes will be covered under the previous policy terms for the full duration of her current treatment. Additionally, we will be implementing a 60-day grandfather clause for all employees whose dependents have active treatments at the time of any future benefits transition. That policy change will be communicated to all staff by end of business today." He looked at his legal counsel, who nodded confirmation. Gage nodded once. "We appreciate that, and we'd like to add something." Walsh waited. Gage slid a check across the table. Walsh picked it up. "Well, 50,000 made out to St. Mary's Charity Care Fund from our organization. For uninsured and underinsured patients, we'd ask one thing in return." Walsh looked up from the check. "A small plaque. In the lobby. Whatever size you think is appropriate. It should read, 'For the nurses who actually care.'" Walsh looked at the check for a long moment. Then he looked up. "I think that's something we can do." Linda didn't know any of this was happening. She'd gone home after her shift, sat with her mother at Rose's kitchen table, and told her they were going to figure it out. She didn't say how. She didn't want to worry her. Rose patted her hand and said, "I know you will, Mija. You always figure things out." Linda drove home and sat in her car in her own driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, because she didn't know how to figure this one out, and she didn't want Rose to see that on her face. Her phone rang at 4:17 p.m. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer it. She was glad she did. It was Preston Walsh, the COO of St. Mary's Hospital. He introduced himself and got straight to the point. He told her that the hospital was granting an immediate exemption for her mother's treatment. Full coverage, previous policy terms, effective immediately. He apologized for the disruption her family had experienced and explained that the hospital was also implementing a permanent policy change to prevent similar situations in the future. He asked if she had any questions. Linda couldn't form words. She sat on her couch, phone pressed to her ear, mouth open, nothing coming out. Walsh waited patiently. Finally she managed. "Why? What changed?" There was a brief pause on his end. "Let's just say the situation was brought to our attention in a way that made the path forward very clear." He paused. "Ms. Reyes, I want you to know that your record at this hospital is exceptional. We should have handled this transition better. I'm sorry we didn't." Linda said thank you 3 times and hung up. She sat completely still for 45 seconds. Then she called her mother. Rose picked up on the second ring. "Mija." Linda's voice broke on the first syllable. Rose said her name again, softer. "Linda, what happened?" Linda took one breath. "Mum, you're covered. The treatment is covered. Everything is covered. You start Tuesday." On the other end of the line, Rose made a sound Linda had never heard from her mother before, a sound of pure, uncomplicated relief. The sound of a woman who had been quietly terrified for 3 weeks and had refused to show it. Rose started her treatment the following Tuesday. The oncology team administered the first cycle of COP without interruption, without delay, exactly within the treatment window the doctors had specified. The first session lasted 7 hours. Linda sat in the waiting room for all 7 of them, working her way through a cup of coffee that went cold and a magazine she couldn't focus on. When Rose came out, pale and tired, but smiling in that stubborn way of hers, Linda stood up and hugged her for a long time. Linda called Doc that evening to thank him. She didn't know exactly what had happened. She'd pieced together that he was involved, that somehow the Hells Angels had organized a meeting with the hospital administration, but she didn't have the details. Doc gave her the broad strokes: 28 members, a conference room, a retired lawyer, a former hospital administrator, and a very uncomfortable COO. Linda was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You donated 50,000, Rude." It wasn't a question. Doc said, "The charity care fund helps uninsured patients." "That's not nothing," Linda said. "You didn't have to do that." Doc said, "We know." She asked why they'd done all of it, the meeting, the research, the donation, all of it for someone they didn't know. Doc was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because someone should. Share this story with someone who needs to hear that people like this exist, because they do. They're out there. And they show up when it matters most." The plaque was installed in the St. Mary's lobby 6 weeks later. It was bronze, 8 inches by 12, mounted near the main entrance where every staff member and every patient passed it each day. For the nurses who actually care. Simple. No donor name. No organization listed. Just those 5 words. Most people who walked past it didn't know the story behind it, but the nurses knew. They knew because the story moved through the hospital the way stories do, when they're real, person to person, shift to shift, department to department. The trauma unit knew first, then the ICU, then oncology. By the time the plaque was installed, every nurse in that building knew what had happened, and every one of them paused, at least once, when they passed it. Linda stood in front of it on the morning it was installed, alone, before her shift started. She put her hand on the bronze surface, cool and solid under her palm, and thought about 18 years, about every patient she'd fought for, about the ones she'd saved and the ones she couldn't, about the moment in the parking garage on the concrete floor, when the weight of all of it had finally become too much. And she thought about a man in a leather vest who had crouched down next to her in the dark and asked one question: "You want to talk about it, or you want me to leave you alone?" The policy change Walsh had promised went out to all staff by end of business that same Thursday. A formal letter signed by the COO, explaining the new 60-day grandfather clause for active treatments during any future benefits transition. It affected 31 other families who had been caught in the same gap as Linda, employees with parents, spouses, or dependent family members in active treatment when the insurance switch happened. For 31 families, a letter arrived that said your coverage is restored, your treatments can continue, you are protected. 31 families who had spent weeks staring at bills they couldn't pay, making calls that went nowhere, filing appeals into the void. 31 families who had been quietly terrified in exactly the same way Rose had been terrified. Each one of them received that letter because Doc heard a woman crying in a parking garage and decided not to walk past. Rose completed her full course of chemotherapy over the following 5 months. The treatment was hard, exhausting, nauseating, relentless, but she made it through every cycle. 3 months after the final session, her oncologist called her in for a follow-up scan. Linda went with her. They sat in the consultation room and waited while the doctor pulled up the images. He looked at the scan for a long time. Then he turned to Rose and said 4 words that Linda had been waiting 6 months to hear. "I'm not seeing anything." Rose nodded like she'd expected it all along. Linda put her face in her hands and cried. Rose patted her arm. "Misha, I told you we'd figure it out." Rose was right, they always had. Doc and Linda stayed in touch. Not frequently, they were both busy people with full lives, but consistently. The kind of friendship that doesn't require constant contact, because the foundation was built in a moment of genuine crisis. He came to a fundraiser she organized for the hospital's charity care fund the following spring. She came to a memorial ride the Hells Angels organized for fallen veterans in the fall. They were different people from different worlds, and somehow that difference had produced something real and lasting. A year after the parking garage, Linda was asked to speak at a hospital staff recognition event. She stood at the podium and talked about 18 years of service, not the commendations, not the statistics, but the moments. The specific, unrepeatable human moments. A patient who held her hand and asked her not to leave. A family who tracked her down 6 months later, just to show her a photograph of the person she'd helped save. The colleague who covered for her the day she got the news about her father. She talked about how working in a trauma unit teaches you something no classroom can, that the difference between catastrophe and survival is often the person who decides to stay, who doesn't walk away, who keeps showing up. She paused for a moment. Then she said, "I've been in this hospital for 18 years. I've seen the best of what people can do in the worst moments possible. And last year, in the darkest moment I personally experienced in my time here, the people who saved my family weren't in the building. They were in a parking garage. They wore leather vests and rode motorcycles and showed up to a meeting no one asked them to come to. They donated $50,000 anonymously and asked for nothing except 5 words on a plaque. And when I asked one of them why, he said, because someone should." She looked out at the room, nurses, administrators, technicians, all of them watching her. "That's what I want to do every day I come to work. I want to be the person who shows up because someone should. I want to be the person who, when someone is sitting on the floor of a parking garage and can't get back up, doesn't walk past. That's it. That's the whole job. That's everything." She stepped back from the podium. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the applause started, and it didn't stop for a long time. If this story moved you even a little, share it right now with someone in your life who works in healthcare, who has fought the insurance system, or who simply needs to be reminded that real brotherhood still exists in this world. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because we're not done telling stories like this one, not even close.